Hello, I'm Courtney Rosenberger, a Managing Director of Policy Research at Strategas, Baird's investment strategy arm. All eyes are in Washington to see if an infrastructure deal can come together, which is what I would like to speak with you about today. To set the stage, President Biden has proposed two plans. The first, a physical infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan, which is paid for with corporate tax increases. And the second, a social infrastructure plan, the American Families Plan, which includes items like childcare, community college, and paid family leave, and is paid for with individual tax increases. There are several pathways a legislative deal could ultimately take. A bipartisan deal could be reached on physical infrastructure, which means that Democrats would then try to pass a separate bill on a party line vote through reconciliation for social infrastructure priorities. Or there could be no bipartisan deal, and Democrats could use reconciliation to pass both physical and social infrastructure. The path ultimately chosen will determine the size, components, and how the bill is paid for. So what's the current state? Republicans and Democrats are currently holding discussions to see if they can reach a bipartisan physical infrastructure deal. The goal is to have an agreement by Memorial Day, and then have a bill hit the House floor the week of June 7th. This is a very tight timeline, and then next week will be critical to see if a deal can be completed. While a bipartisan deal is not our base case, we take the negotiations seriously. Both parties have motivation for seeking an agreement across the aisle. For the GOP, Republicans hope that if they do a bipartisan deal with Democrats, the appetite for more spending later this year will fade. It also helps that infrastructure is popular with voters and members of both parties. For Democrats, a bipartisan deal means the legislation can go through regular order, which requires 60 votes in the Senate, rather than using the reconciliation process. While reconciliation only requires 51 votes, it has a number of rules and restrictions which make it a less ideal way of passing infrastructure legislation. If a bipartisan deal fails, and Democrats have to use reconciliation, some of their priorities may not meet the rules to be included in the package. But the two parties still have to reach an agreement on size, spending components, and pay-fors to reach a bipartisan physical infrastructure deal. So let's talk about the size and spending differences. President Biden's physical infrastructure proposal, the American Jobs Plan, proposed $2.25 trillion worth of spending. We expect that any deal that passes, be it bipartisan or via reconciliation, will ultimately be smaller in size. But a bipartisan deal would be notably smaller in size. Senator Capito, the point Republican senator in negotiations, in April countered the American Jobs Plan with a $568 billion proposal. Her proposal, contrasted with Biden's proposal, shows the disagreements between the parties as to what should be considered infrastructure. As you can see in this slide, Senator Capito's proposal was focused more on what would typically be considered traditional infrastructure, like roads, highways, and bridges, and funding was notably absent for areas like housing, schools, and electric vehicles. But more recently, Senate Minority Leader McConnell has indicated a willingness for $800 billion of spending, and Republicans have indicated to the White House that they could go upwards of $1 trillion worth of spending. A notable recent development is also that Senator Capito said Republicans could be open to funding EV charging stations as part of a bipartisan deal. These moves, combined with Democrats' openness for a smaller price tag for this plan, knowing that they'll try and pass another bill on their own, shows progress. But spending is just one part of the equation here. Finding agreement between the two sides on how to pay for infrastructure will be the most difficult part of the process. Democrats are looking at corporate tax increases to pay for physical infrastructure. The American Jobs Plan included $2.5 trillion worth of tax increases on corporations, with multinationals particularly targeted due to the changes to treatment of foreign income. If a bipartisan deal fails, we expect corporate tax increases to be part of a Democrat-only bill. We would note that we're already seeing significant lobbying from S&P 500 companies on tax issues. Far more companies lobbied on tax issues in the first quarter of 2021 than lobbied on infrastructure and climate issues. Republicans have rejected corporate tax increases as part of a bipartisan deal. Republicans view the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in 2017 and cut taxes, as a top achievement of the Trump presidency. Moreover, there is concern that the Biden plan will disadvantage U.S. companies relative to foreign competitors. Members of both parties have just suggested that instead of corporate tax increases, user fees could be an area where there's agreement, which would be imposing user fees on vehicles miles traveled. But that's been rejected by the Biden White House, which views user fees as breaking President Biden's pledge to not raise taxes on those earning less than $400,000. So that's quite a conundrum where there's no agreement immediately on the pay-fors, but there's still a number of options that the two sides could use to pursue pay-fors for the package. Those include, 1, treating the deal as a surface transportation bill. The current surface transportation bill, or highway bill, the 2015 FAST Act, expires at the end of this fiscal year on September 30th. If policymakers treat the infrastructure deal as a surface transportation reauthorization bill, then they can pull funds from the Highway Trust Fund, which is the primary pay-for mechanism. Another pay-for would be selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This was also done to pay for the 2015 Surface Transportation Bill, and the SPR currently holds nearly 630 million barrels worth of crude oil. Another method would be increased tax enforcement. This is one of the most bipartisan of the ideas that have been proposed as a pay-for. It would involve actually giving the IRS more funding to go after tax evaders. Policymakers believe that $80 billion in increased funding to the IRS could yield a net $240 billion in new tax revenue. And then lastly, drug pricing. And this is not currently part of the conversation, but including measures like changing rebate rules or pursuing limiting price increases to inflation on drugs would generate hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue offsets that could be used as a pay-for. So there's certainly a lot of moving parts right now when it comes to infrastructure and Washington policy, but we're keeping an eye on them very closely. Thank you so much for your time today.